All right, in this video, we'll begin talking about the nervous system. We'll talk about how nerves work, and we'll talk about specific nerves, and we'll move on to the central nervous system, which is the brain, spinal cord. In the next unit, we'll deal with the peripheral nervous system, sensory organs, and different things. So the nervous system as a whole will be broken up into 2 units. So a little bit about the nervous system. The nervous system is the master controlling and communicating system of the body. It's in control of the body and then communicates those controls to the rest of the body, causing them to do whatever they do. Cells communicate via electrical and chemical signals. And so most of the nerve impulses are electrical, and then there's chemicals involved also to pass that electrical input from one nerve to the next. We'll talk more about that later. Most of the time is a very quick kind of response, and so this is almost an instantaneous kind of thing that's going on. The nervous system basically has 3 overlapping functions, and you see those here on this screen. There is some sort of sensory input, so you're using your 5 senses, or it could be internal senses that you don't know about, like hunger or thirst or temperature, those sorts of things. There's some sort of sensory input. Then the central nervous system integrates that input. Integration is think about processing, making decisions about. Sometimes this happens without your conscious thought, and sometimes this happens consciously. Like I see a pencil, I pick up that pencil. That is conscious. Unconscious would be my temperature is dropping, therefore I start shivering. You don't decide to start shivering. Your body initiates that response. And that is the third thing, the motor output. Motor output is one of 2 things. It can usually be it's a muscle, like see the pencil, pick up the pencil, or a gland. My blood sugar has increased, therefore my pancreas releases insulin. And so that is both a form of motor output. The nervous system is divided into 2 principal parts. And so we're about to get into the deep weeds here with these divisions. And so make sure that you're keeping up here. There's 2 main divisions, or anatomical type divisions, and they're the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And I'll always abbreviate those CNS and PNS. And so the central nervous system involves the brain and the spinal cord. Again, the central nervous system is where integration happens, interprets sensory input, and dictates motor output. And then peripheral nervous system is everything else, all the other nerves, the sensory organs as well. And so then we're going to leave off the central nervous system, and we're going to divide the peripheral nervous system further into 2 functional divisions. So again, we're going down this rabbit hole here. So the functional divisions of the peripheral nervous system are called the afferent and efferent divisions. Another word for afferent would be the sensory division, and another word for efferent would be the motor division. It makes sense, right? So you have a sensory. The afferent division is receiving sensory input. Skin is what's shown here. It could be eyes, ears, nose, mouth, whatever it is, sensory input. And the efferent division then is having that motor output that we talked about. And so it transmits from the CNS, from the brain, from the spinal cord, out to the muscles and the glands. Now, the efferent division is further divided into 2 sections. Those are the autonomic efferent pathway, as you see there, and the somatic efferent pathway. All right. And so again, just make sure you're keeping up with this. We have sensory motor for peripheral nervous system, and motor is divided into somatic and autonomic. Somatic is that conscious input that you are voluntarily doing. This has to do with muscles. So somatic or soma means body. And so think your body doing this. You're deciding to do this. The autonomic nervous system, the autonomic literally means self, and nomos is law. So this is a law to itself, meaning that this is happening without your conscious input. This is involuntary, so to speak. All right. And so the somatic then is divided further, or the autonomic then is divided further into divisions as well. So you have back here, you have the somatic, and then we're going to divide the autonomic into two further divisions, and they are the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. All right. And so for these two, this has to do with your think of subconscious responses to things. And so the sympathetic is the fight or flight response. All right. And so this has when this part of your autonomic nervous system is initiated, there are certain things that happens, and you see this on the left hand side. Think of like the danger is happening. There's something causing you to be stressed. It could happen from people have panic attacks, and it causes this to also kind of be initiated as well. But you can see there's those there. The other side of that is parasympathetic, and this has to do with feeding, like just digestion in general. Think of more calm activities. Also, like mating or reproductive activity. These are the kinds of things that happen with the parasympathetic nervous system. I mean, it makes sense. On one hand, if you're stressed out, you're not digesting. Think of a prey species. It's not digesting during that time. But on the other side, when things are calm, it's able to reproduce, able to eat and digest. And so these are those two divisions. They work opposite of one another. All right, so let's talk a little bit about nervous tissue histology, which, remember, histology is just tissues. There are basically two kinds of tissues found in nervous cells, and they are neurons. And you see the word neuron there, and neurons are just nerve cells. And the nerve cells are doing the work of the nervous system in that they are transmitting the electrical impulse. And then there is the neuroglia down here. And the best way to think about the neuroglia is they are the supporting cells for the nervous system. They are the ones that are kind of keeping the nervous system all together. You can see this astrocyte here is an example of neuroglia. It's like binding everything together. It's almost like a support structure for the nervous cells. Now, I don't have this, of course. I don't have a slide for this, but the only two neuroglia cells that I want you to know are, and I did see it on the other slide, are the cells that make the myelin sheath, and we'll talk about the myelin sheath in a minute. There are cells that make the myelin sheath for the peripheral nervous system, and they're called Schwann cells here, named after somebody. The Schwann cells are the ones that make the myelin sheath. We'll talk about the myelin sheath in a minute. The cells that make the myelin sheath for the central nervous system are called oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes, just spelled like it sounds. All right. And so there are other, like you see this astrocyte here. It's an example of neuroglia. You don't need to know what an astrocyte is, but I only want you to know two of those supporting cells, and those are the cells that make the myelin sheath. Oligodendrocytes for CNS. Oligio means like ruler, like think oligarch, government. Dendrocyte, it's just a nerve cell. All right. Schwann cells, it's probably named after somebody named Schwann. So let's talk about neurons and the different parts of a neuron. You will need to know all of these parts of neurons. And again, they're the nerve cells. A couple things about them before we go in. These are highly specialized cells. As you can see here, it doesn't look like any cell that we've talked about so far. They can be they can last a long time. So you have nerve cells that can last your entire lifetime. So they have an extreme longevity compared to other types of cells. They don't go through mitosis once they're being made, with a few exceptions. Nerves can repair themselves, but some nerves just can't. So once they're there, they're there for life, and they can't really repair themselves. Sometimes nerve tissue does repair itself, but it just takes a long time. All right. They can also be very, very long. And so we'll give you some examples in a moment. Some nerve cells can be up to 1 meter in length. So these can be very long cells, and they have a very high metabolic rate. They need a continuous supply of oxygen and glucose feeding these cells. And so let's look at the parts of a neuron. First, there is the cell body. And sometimes you'll see this called the soma, S-O-M-A, but cell body seems to be more accepted nowadays. And the cell body is just the main body of the cell. It has all the bits in there, the nucleus and so forth, that makes it like other cells that we've talked about. There are the dendrites. Now that prefix dendra just means tree, and you can kind of see this look like little trees sprouting out. The dendrites are the receiving portions of the nerve cell. They receive input from the outside, probably from another neuron, or could be from sensory input, and they send that message to the cell body. And so you can see where it says cell body is the receptive region. It's receiving all of those informations, the biosynthetic center. What is it doing? It's synthesizing all that information that's receiving. All right. Then there's this axon, this long rope-like structure. And each neuron has one axon. And so all that information is gathered together and it's sent out on the axon. The axon is the sending portion of the neuron, or sometimes you'll see it called the conducting portion of the neuron. There is this, they call this area here, right, this cone-shaped area right before the axon called the axon hillock. Some neurons, axons are very short, some are very long, again up to 1 meter in length. And at the very end of the axon, you may have several of these areas called axon terminals. Terminal just means the end. And this is where neurotransmitter is secreted. We'll talk more about that in a later lecture. And again, the terminal, this is where you're going to secrete neurotransmitters, release it into the extracellular space, which that extracellular space is called the synapse. We'll look at that again later. And then you have the myelin sheath, which you can see here, these Schwann cells, and they produce that myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is a lipid-based structure or substance that coats the axon. And the purpose of the myelin sheath is to insulate the electrical signal. If you think of like a wire, like if you just grab, like your phone charger, for instance, it's covered in plastic. The reason it's covered in plastic is twofold. Well, when you pick your phone charger cord up, it doesn't shock you. And so the myelin sheath protects the surrounding tissues from the electricity that's going through the nerve. And secondly, if you took all the plastic off of your phone cord and then just left it there, it would no longer conduct electricity very well. It would, but it wouldn't, the signal would be very weak. And so the purpose of the myelin sheath is also to increase the nerve impulse transmission. You can see here, these gaps are on purpose. There are gaps all up and down the axon. We'll talk more about what those gaps mean in a later video. But this is the neuron. You should be familiar with the parts of the neuron and what their functions are.